Put your seatbelts on and get ready for the ride. We're the freaking New York Jets, so we're built for this shit.
Hello and welcome to another episode of In the Trenches with Gang Green. I'm your host, Bubbs. Today is Wednesday, February 5th. Hopefully everybody's having a good day so far today. This is episode 484 of the In the Trenches with Gang Green podcast. I thank you, as always, for joining me. And we've got some latest New York Jets news to talk about today on the podcast, as Darren Mougey has begun to make some changes to the New York Jets front office. And I also want to get into some comments made by Thomas Dimitroff this weekend in a few interviews that he did down in Radio Row in New Orleans for the Super Bowl, on his plan for the Jets, how the interview process went, how he views the Aaron Rodgers situation. Some really, really good insight from Dimitroff. Also a nugget on if he would be interested in returning to the NFL in a non-GM role. So we'll get into that as well a little bit later on today in the program. As always, for those tuning in on YouTube, make sure to please like and subscribe. I appreciate your support so much, means a lot. And thank you to those of you tuning in on all the different audio podcast platforms as well. As always, let's tell you about our podcast partners, starting with our friends over at BetUS, America's favorite online sportsbook. We are now just a couple days away from the big game. Let's take a look. Super Bowl 59 prop bets for this weekend. Who do you feel will take away or come away with this one with the victory? Do the Eagles take down the Chiefs, or does Kansas City make history and three-peat? We will see on Sunday. If you want to get in on any of the betting action, check out BetUS. Use my link in the description of this video to get a 125% sign-up bonus on your first three deposits up to $2,000. Also, our friends over at SeatGeek, looking to get out to Super Bowl 59 or any other sporting event, any of the best events in entertainment, plays, concerts, shows, you name it, SeatGeek has it. Use promo code BUBSONSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase and get yourself out to some awesome events. And also our friends over at Huga House, they just released brand new hats. They also have released sweatshirts for the first time. So if you want any of the new arrivals that are going very quickly or any of their other awesome selection of hats, use promo code BUBS for 15% off any purchase. And when you use that promo code on your first hat, you'll get 30% off your second hat as well. So check them out and get yourself some awesome Huga House swag. So here we go, episode 484. Some New York Jets news to discuss here on the program. Obviously, Aaron Glenn continues to round out his coaching staff, with moves still expected to be made in a couple areas there. So far, 10 coaches have been named to his coaching staff, 5 on the offensive side of the football, 4 on the defensive side of the football, and then, of course, Chris Banjo becoming the special teams coordinator here for the Jets. But Darren Mougey's also doing some work of his own here as the Jets continue to restructure and really kind of do a complete 180 with this new regime within this organization, as Darren Mougey and the Jets over the last 24 hours or so have made a couple moves in the front office. So we'll start here. They have moved on from 2 front office people, the first being co-director of player personnel Greg Nejma, who they mutually parted ways with. He spent 16 seasons with the franchise, heavy role in scouting. He is out. They also fired senior director of football administration and most recently football strategy David Sosey. He was with the organization for 8 seasons, was a very heavy contract guy, was a very heavy salary cap guy for the New York Jets over the last many years here, of course, too, with the Douglas and Saleh regime as well. So those 2 guys are out. We've also learned that Phil Savage is listed as a consultant now on the team website. So does feel like, and things could still change, still a very fluid situation. It's still only February. I think a lot more, of course, is going to happen here once the Super Bowl is over and the bow is officially placed on the 2024 season and all 32 teams are now in the offseason. I think you'll start to see a lot more movement. The Jets, I also think you'll start to see more movement after the draft. A lot of times teams, from a scouting perspective, tend to make changes post-draft. They usually tend to kind of go through this draft process with these scouts in place. They've already been doing a lot of work. You're already, kind of in this process already from the start of the college season now. And then after the draft, that's when you start to make those changes for 2026 and onward. So I think over the next couple months, obviously even over the next couple days, it's still a very fluid situation here for Mougey and this front office. But Phil Savage is an interesting name just because he was the interim GM. He actually was a name that, look, was not going to happen, but some wondered, okay, as a general manager candidate, if you wanted to throw him on there. He was actually a guy that has been with the organization now for a long time, has got a lot of experience. Somebody you wondered if they would keep around or not. It seems like he's around at the moment. They've kind of turned him now into a consultant, so we'll see if that happens. If that continues to be that way, but that's the update there on Phil Savage. Now, we also heard earlier today, this is one of the bigger updates, to replace Greg Nejma as the co-director of player personnel. The New York Jets are bringing in one of Darren Mougey's guy, from Denver. This was from earlier today. A report per source, Broncos scout Rob Patton is leaving to join Darren Mougey and become the Jets' co-director of player personnel. Rob has been with the Broncos since 2017, 4 years before his uncle, George Patton, became Broncos GM. Mougey was Broncos assistant GM until he became Jets GM 2 weeks ago. So there's the update there. Those are the most recent updates. Nejma out, David Sosey out, and to replace Nejma, it is Rob Patton. We don't have the exact replacement yet for Sosey. I'm sure we'll get that soon. Phil Savage listed as a consultant, so that seems to be his role moving forward. I think if you're a Jet fan, you should be okay with this from Darren Mougey. You should be happy about this. You want to do a complete 180. This new coaching staff, the only carryover is Sean Jefferson, which it feels like that is more so because of the relationship with Garrett Wilson. It is smart. Move on from the other coaches, especially on the offensive staff, which has been a disaster. And it's also smart to completely turn things around in the front office. Do a complete 180. Bring in your people. I think one of the better ways to describe it, right? Drain the swamp. All right, move on. 14 years of losing. Get this stench out of the organization. Let Mougey hire his people. Let Glenn hire his people and move forward with this regime with very little turnover, with just a couple names such as Savage and Jefferson and guys like that. Obviously, Jaime probably will stick around. And I will also say this too with Mougey, as he continues on this trend here of turning over the front office and making changes, which is the smart thing to do, the right thing to do. We've talked about this so many times during this process, before this process, about how everybody in the building, they need to completely fumigate the building and do a complete 180 and restart, which they're doing. But I also think it's important for Mougey to get some other experience in this building. Get another guy. I would love to hire a football operations guy. I would love to hire somebody to kind of be the barrier between Mougey and Glenn and Woody and kind of have that guy oversee everything, whether that's maybe a Curtis Martin. You saw what the Jaguars did, taking one of their former players and bringing him in as the president of football operations. Maybe that's what you do with a Curtis Martin, somebody like that who was floated out there a couple months ago. Maybe it's a Thomas Dimitroff, who we'll talk about here in a second, didn't rule out a possibility non-executive GM opportunity or a non-GM executive opportunity in the NFL had popped up. I still think it's important for Mougey. Good first step moving on from some of these guys that have been in this organization a long time and have obviously just been just in here with a ton of losing. Good step there for him to bring in his own people, especially the connections with Denver, a team that they've just seen turn around. All fine with that, but also let's see some more experience. And hopefully that comes here as the rest of the offseason rolls along. So Darren Mougey is cleaning house. Some other updates here as well. Jets also need to look for a new strength and conditioning coach. Again, we talked about it earlier. Expect some more moves to potentially come after the 2025 draft to make changes with the scouting department. So still a lot more things to happen. A lot more dominoes need to fall in this 2025 offseason, which is really just beginning here in early February. All right, now let's move on. Thomas Dimitroff, who I would have liked to be talking about right now as the New York Jets general manager. He was my top choice. You all know that, but that's not the case. They roll with Mougey. They roll with Glenn. You've got to believe. You've got to hope that they get this thing right, and we'll see what happens. But Thomas Dimitroff is down in New Orleans this weekend at Radio Row, and I'll just say this to anybody out there, just as a kind of a PSA. If you haven't listened to any of his interviews, definitely go listen. It's awesome. He's been on multiple different interviews, and I might be forgetting some, so I apologize if I'm forgetting anybody. But he was on with Zach Gelb first. Then he was on Brandon, BT, and Sal on WFAN on Tuesday. So yesterday, he was on with Jake Asman. He's been on with a ton of people across the NFL, and I've listened to like 5 or 6 of his interviews, and they're awesome. And there's so much good detail. There's a lot of really good things he says. Very smart football mind. Of course, a guy that had a ton of success in Atlanta, building things over there. So just if you're a football fan, not even if you're a Jet fan, just a football fan, he's somebody that's really, really interesting to listen to. But especially if you're a Jet fan, because he really has detailed in a lot of these interviews over the last couple of days, the process of the interview and really the biggest piece, what he would do with Rodgers. So we'll get into that aspect here in a second. But I wanted to play this clip a little bit longer, minute and a half. This was from Zach Gelb on Monday, talking about the interview process, how he feel it went, kind of how Woody was in it. Some really good insight. Here's Dimitroff on what took place with the Jets interview when he took it. First guy to take it back in December, of course, after they fired Joe Douglas.
Was there an edict when you talked to the Jets and the conversations came up about Aaron Rodgers? This idea that Woody Johnson and Aaron don't see eye to eye, and I know Aaron Glenn supposedly wants Aaron back. Was Woody maybe at all pushing that Aaron would not be back on the team in the interview process?
No, without getting a ton of detail about that, no, not at all. I think he was really, I'm sure, and knowing his approach to this, he really wanted to hear the interview people talking about what they would truly do, and he didn't want to influence in any way, I'm sure, of what that response would be. So I would be really interested to sit in there. If I could be Rick Spielman and Mike Tannenbaum to say, listening to the different approaches, how many of those people said, no, keep him another year, right? We'll draft someone potentially and help them learn. I don't know if there were many of those. That's just my hypothetically.
When you gave your answer, though, when you were talking to them, did you kind of sense, they like the answer, or was it, they definitely don't want this guy back? If you were maybe thinking about getting rid of him.
You know, it's a really interesting thought. I was trying to gauge that, and I couldn't really gauge it. But what I would say is, in my mind, if I were to be a president or someone over top of that, I would want that person to come in and be very stout about what they believe in. That would make it a lot easier than hem-hawing around about it, right? Like, kind of, sort of, kind of. I wouldn't want that, right? I want that guy that's coming in who's going to believe in it, and whether we agree or not, that they're going to move forward on. I think that's a big thing when you're interviewing a general manager.
So a lot of really good detail there from Dimitroff on how the interview went. First, non-Rodgers point that he made. He said this early on, right? Woody, Gelb mentioned Woody hasn't said or didn't say in the interview for him one way or the other whether he wants to trade. No talks about trading Rodgers. No talks about trying to push his thoughts on one of these candidates about not bringing Rodgers back, right? We've heard the reports of that Woody doesn't get along with Rodgers and Rodgers doesn't get along with Woody and all that stuff. And Woody doesn't want Rodgers back. And we've heard Woody multiple times now say that, publicly, he said that, it's going to be up to the GM. It's going to be up to the head coach. And that's all good to say publicly. But you do wonder, of course, what happens behind closed doors. And this, being behind closed doors, this interview, Dimitroff there talking about how Woody, the floor was his, right? Woody didn't have any say in the interview about, oh, I don't want Rodgers back. Do you want him back? Like, he didn't state his opinion. It was open to the candidate. He wasn't pushing his opinion on Rodgers. It's ultimately the GM and the head coach's decision, which is the right thing to do. And I continue to say this about Woody Johnson. We don't know if this is really a point where where he's actually going to give Mougey and Glenn a chance here. But at least some of the things he's saying, it's like, hopefully this is finally a sign for him to step back and get himself out of the football stuff and just let the football people make football decisions. Hopefully that's the case. We won't know until, a couple years from now when the bombshells start to report. You also probably get a good idea pretty early on if this thing's going to work out or not. But just step away, Woody. Step away. So at least it's been good, especially hearing here from Dimitroff, that his word has been he's not going to have any say on it. Didn't have any say on it. Wasn't pushing that at all in the interviews, which is a positive. Now, Dimitroff put some good points on the table, too, for Rodgers. And I don't have the exact clip, but I do have some quotes here on Dimitroff. Still thinks Rodgers can play, but feels it shouldn't be with the Jets. Couple quotes that he said. He felt it would be, quote, best to move on from Rodgers. He also said, quote, for that organization to truly resurrect, rekindle, and do all they need to do, it would be best to move on. And look, Thomas Dimitroff making this point is really, really interesting. And it's another reason why I really wanted him here was, number one, because of his experience, but number two, really because of the experience, but also number two, what he took over in Atlanta, right? It's not like this is a guy, not just the fact that he has 13 years under his belt and has a 113-95 record and took a team to the Super Bowl, but you look at what he took over in Atlanta. It was a disaster. The previous season in Atlanta, they went 4-12. It was a mess. It was a train wreck. He comes in, Dimitroff, Mike Smith come in, and they turn that organization around in 1 year, in the snap of a finger. In 2008, they go 11-5, make the playoffs. Now, they didn't win a playoff game. They lost in the wild card, but they made the playoffs. Right? And boom, right out of the gate, out of their first 5 years, 4 of them, they were in the postseason. Dimitroff knows what it takes to take a team from the bottom, like he said in that quote, an organization that really needs to resurrect, rekindle, and do all they need to do, take a team from the bottom and get them back up to the top. And it's interesting to hear his insight on, as opposed to going the Rodgers angle of Rodgers for 1 year as a bridge, maybe more so taking the less baggage angle, I like to call it. Rodgers comes with a lot of baggage, taking the Tyrod possibility, taking the veteran that's not Rodgers and a rookie and putting them together, competing in camp, then going out there in 2025. If it fails, then 2026, you're going to have a top pick, as opposed to Rodgers in 25, still try and compete, then go 26. So it's interesting. It's also interesting, too, you got to think from Dimitroff's angle, right? He saw a locker room that was in disarray in Atlanta. Next year, they were in the playoffs, first year under him. Would it help the Jets? This is weird. Nobody knows, but is it beneficial if the Jets would have a guy in year one of Glenn and Mougey, to have a guy that polarizing of Rodgers in the building? Would it be? Or would that be a good thing to have a Hall of Fame quarterback around? Or is it a bad thing? The fact that he's very powerful, he's going to want a lot of say. Even if he says on the outside, Rodgers and his ego, he's still going to want to say a lot of say. How is him and a first-time offensive coordinator work? We'll see. But it is interesting to hear, of course, Dimitroff and his angle on things. He also talked about how he was curious to see how many GMs actually wanted Rodgers. He felt not many. And we'll probably never really know unless if more GMs come out like Dimitroff did. But out of all the GMs, how many really wanted Rodgers? Was it 50-50? Was it like a 60-40 one way or another? Was it really uneven, like 90-10? did out of 16 interviewed or whatever it was, 15, 60, did like 12 not want him and 3 wanted him? I would very intrigued to hear that too. But at the end of the day, what matters most is what Mougey and Aaron Glenn want, because those are the two guys here. But still very interesting to hear some of his takes on things and how a GM going into that interview process views Rodgers and how some of these other guys can view him. And I've said it. I think some of these hires that the Jets have made on the offensive staff personally make it less likely Rodgers returns, especially just from a schematic standpoint. Because a lot of what Tanner Engstrand and the Lions do is the complete opposite of what Aaron Rodgers wants to do. And we've talked about that. Rodgers, we've all known for a while now, would need to learn a new system. But would he be willing to do that? Right? They run a ton of play action. Rodgers does not like play action. They run a ton of plays from under center. Rodgers does not run plays under center. The Jets ran a lot of shotgun last year. Some of that was because of the torn Achilles coming off of it and not having to less stress on the Achilles, right? But you even look at some of his numbers in Green Bay, was never a under center quarterback, was a lot of times a shotgun guy. And never he's known for this, not running play action. The Lions did a lot of that. The Lions also run the ball a lot. The Jets did not last year. So, a lot of what the Lions do and Tanner Engstrand's going to bring, Rodgers doesn't. So we'll see if he'd be up to it. Definitely will be interesting. Now, one of the other important parts, too, I think, from Dimitroff before we close up shop today, he did say he'd be interested. He would be open to a non-GM executive position in the NFL. Which, look, sign me up. I would be so on board if you hired Dimitroff. I've said it now for a very long time. A Spielman, a Dimitroff, one of those guys to come in here and oversee things, I would be so on board for the New York Jets. I don't know if Dimitroff would do it just because of, number one, maybe he'd want to wait, right? He just went through this process, didn't get the job. He's also got his own business he's running. He seems like he's kind of content right now. But I would also say, right, if the Jets... And I guess it's more so Mougey wanting him, not so much the Jets. Like, if Mougey reached out to him, maybe that's a little bit different. But in the back of Dimitroff's mind, it's like, I interviewed for the GM job. Now I'm going to come here and kind of get a lesser role. If you really wanted me, you should have just hired me. So that could be interesting. But look, it's another name to keep an eye. It's a name to keep an eye on. I'd be totally on board with it. Not even just a guy like Dimitroff, but again, I talk about this a lot. I know I've repeated this a lot today, but a guy that can come in and oversee things and help Mougey and kind of create that barrier between Woody and this new regime. I think it's important. Whoever that might be. I think it's important to get that hire in here at some point. So, anyway, let me know what you think in the comments section down below on Darren Mougey and the latest cleaning of house for the New York Jets. Also, some of your thoughts on Thomas Dimitroff's comments. Aaron Rodgers returning, Aaron Rodgers not returning. I plan on here in the coming days, maybe even next week, sometime here, doing a video on the whole Aaron Rodgers situation and the pros of him coming back, the cons of him coming back. I want to get into some, again, schematic stuff and how he could, how the whole Tanner Engstrand Rodgers things work, because I know it just touched upon it, but I want to kind of take a deep dive into the whole Aaron Rodgers decision and everything that should go into it, and really what's the best course of action here for the New York Jets, as it's a big one and one that we should get soon here. We should get soon. Once the Super Bowl ends next week, off season's really officially here for everybody. That's when things can really start to pick up. So see what happens. So thank you so much for watching. We'll have a lot more content coming your way. And as always, until next time, JETS, 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 Jets.